Welcome to the webinar on devolved finance and governance of climate change adaptation here at DIIS. My name is Esben Friis Hansen. I'm a senior researcher at DIIS, and in working with devolved finance and governance of climate change adaptation. Adaptation is people's response to adverse effects of climate change. And good adaptation is closely integrated with development and often highly context specific. Let me give you an example. In February, I was in Arusha, this region in Tanzania, together with a team of researchers from the GAP research program. And we interviewed village administration staff and politicians and people about climate change adaptation finance. And what we found was very limited access to finance for these local governments. And the finance they had was in the form of development programs, which had been tagged by donors to have a climate change adaptation aspects. We found no discretion. That is, the local elected politicians and administrative staff and people had no say in setting the priorities and for climate change adaptation. What they simply did was administrative decisions taken in Washington or Dodoma, the capital of Tanzania. And meanwhile, outside the window of the local government, you had Maasai struggling with a prolonged drought, having to send most of their livestock to outside the district, even to Kenya. So what we realized is this was an example of how this finance going for climate change adaptation is perhaps not the most cost-effective way of this to happen, that there would be other priorities if people were allowed to do it themselves in the local governments. This is a wider problem in the financial architecture for climate change adaptation. While we're beginning to see that international donors, the northern countries, are reaching 80 billion and moving towards the $100 billion a year promised during the Paris Agreement. The bulk of this goes to middle-income countries and to mitigation, but in 2018, around $5 billion went for climate change adaptation to least developed countries. However, we have a big problem in getting this funding all the way out to the local level. IID has a quite quoted figure of only 10% of the funding is reaching the local level. I think the truth is we don't really know. There is a lack of research, there's a lack of knowledge. It's not recorded how much money gets out, but it's definitely a very small amount of finance which actually reach the end users, and it's very little say the local government has in terms of how the money should be used. Today we have three excellent speakers who will share light over the main governance challenges to devolved adaptive finance and ways forward in improving devolved adaptation and finance governance. The first is Lily Solomon Lindegaard, who will talk about this recent DIIS report. The next will be Judith Mulva from Kenya, who talk about a Kenyan perspective, and last, Sam Green from IIED, who will provide us an international governance perspective. And thereafter, we will have 20-25 minutes for discussions of, we have collected questions and I will ask them to the panels. So today we will not have an active chat function. I'll leave the word to Lily. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Espen. Yes, so recently we've come out with a new DIIS report. You can see it on the shelf behind me. You can also find it on DIIS DK. And the report looks at these questions of devolved adaptation, finance, and governance. And what it tries to do is give a status of devolved finance and kind of efforts and debates around this. And it also tries to focus especially on the governance aspects, which are quite critical because this is not a technical exercise, getting the money out, how it's used and by whom. So it's a central part of successful devolution, but it's relatively under-researched. So we're trying to shed light on that. And these debates, we see them being driven by two major kind of dynamics on an international level. And the first is, of course, slowly but surely increasing adaptation finance globally. We're still headed towards the $100 billion a year. And that's, of course, driven debates on how this finance is used. And then, of course, also increasing implementation of adaptation as we're working out programs, planning and policies and so on. And this is actually starting to get down to the ground and efforts on the ground, of course, prompting discussions about how that's done. And so in the report, we have some sections, and I'm only able to give highlights here in the short time that we have. But we give key actors and considerations in these debates. And in terms of the key actors, we have a group of international policy think tanks that's been very influential, for instance, with the locally led adaptation agenda. We have multilateral development banks, we have civil society organizations, and also national governments. And these in various ways and with various perspectives have kind of driven this debate around devolved adaptation finance. But then we take a step back after giving these different perspectives in the report and drawing on a lot of the well-established research in international development and also the emerging research on adaptation. We try to pull out relevant considerations around governance particularly. And that brought us to 7 key considerations, and I'll just go through them quickly here. So of course we have, that subsidiarity came up very high on our list. And it's basically to say that, of course, locally led is important, and devolving to a local level. At the same time, you have a consideration about what is the lowest appropriate level to get the job done. And you can have gains by perhaps coming into a district level or a national regional level. And that can be gains in terms of efficiency, but also capacity in relation to certain projects, certain sectors, and so on. You have integration in local government planning and decision-making, and this helps make adaptation more institutionally sustained and politically acceptable. You have spaces for public deliberation and participation, because we know that adaptation can be contested. We know that input from a local level, from local populations and different local voices is important. We have devolution of decision-making over climate finance. So as Espen says, it's not just about decisions being made at a higher level that are then implemented locally, but that actually you have local discretion and there's the ability to prioritize and to develop locally oriented solutions. You have decision-making informed by local knowledge and local needs. And of course, that's linked to having this discretion. So discretion doesn't exactly and doesn't not ensure that you have local knowledge and needs being reflected, but it's an important prerequisite. And then you have predictability of financial flows. We want adaptation that's institutionally sustainable. And to do that, it's very difficult when you have projects with a short time span that are unplanned in relation to each other in different sectors. It's difficult to build a sustainable institutional capacity. And lastly, supportive national policy environment, because we've had so much focus on devolution and the local level, but at the same time, it's essential to have support from a national level to make that happen. So these are the key considerations that we came forwards to. And then we tried to look at what's actually being done around devolution. What are some of the different models that have been used so far? And we assessed those in terms of these considerations. And this is what we ended up with. And we went through 4 different models developed by different actors and also being implemented in different places. So you can't really compare one to one, but this gives an indication of what some of their strengths might be in terms of these governance considerations that I just outlined. And of course that they have, because they're different models, they're anchored differently, the institutions involved are different, the processes are different, they have different strengths and different weaknesses or things that can be further developed. Because I'd like to underline that these are all very early models. You know, we're in the beginning of trying to think more about how adaptation can be devolved. And these models, they give us insight into different ways that that might be done. So in the report, you can see more discussion about all of this. And beyond going into these specific models for each for some of the different actors involved. You see we have the PPCR from World Bank, we have ALP, Adaptation Learning Program from CARE, the Local mechanism from UNCDF, and we have the County Climate Change Fund in Kenya. So these are very different and we have further discussion about them. We also, at the end of the report, we come in with how might donors kind of assess in their own portfolios, how they're doing in terms of devolution. And so we go into that a bit as well. For more information on all of this, it's available in the report with a lot of discussion. And just to leave you on a note of kind of what we're looking at going forward, I mean, what we concluded in the report is that, of course, you have these early different models. They give us different ideas about what different mechanisms can offer in terms of governance. And so you have very interesting developments that are already happening on the ground, and we can build on those going forward. And that will, of course, require more engagement in this field and further research as well. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lily, and thanks for keeping the time. You were even only 8 minutes. I will put the words on to Judith Mulva, who's a PhD student at the GAP program, but perhaps you can introduce yourself, talking about governing devolved adaptation finance perspectives from Kenya. I'll hand the word over to you, Judith.
Thank you so much, Esban. My name is Judith. I'm a PhD researcher at Kenyatta University under the GAP program that is financed by DIIS. And part of my PhD study, I am looking at the devolved system in Kenya and how it's influencing climate adaptation finance in terms of its implementation, operationalization. And it's very interesting to see that Kenya is actually doing very well, bearing in mind that Kenya is governed through the devolved or has embraced the devolved governance system. And this means that we have the national government, but also we have the county system or the county governance system. And the national government, of course, as you know, this is where the budgets are set. This is where decisions are made, which is, underlined under the Ministry of Environment, but then the climate finance aspect is under the Ministry of Finance. Interestingly, depending on different times, I think climate finance has been a topic of discussion, not only from the public, but also from the private sectors. But looking at it from the public sector, we've seen that Kenya has, in terms of the financial flows, there's a lot of money that is coming into Kenya, as you would know, for adaptation. And this is, of course, streamlined into the budgetary system. And the budget allocations are then streamlined into, or rather they're channeled to the county treasury. And the county government, of course, then prioritizes what is important for them. And different counties, of course, have prioritized this through their county integrated development plans. Climate change has always been an issue because, as you would know, majority of the Kenyan landscape is arid or semi-arid. So climate change is actually a huge issue, and adaptation, of course, looking at how communities have been resilient, is top of the priorities when you're looking at the county integrated development plans. However, it is very sad to see that however much that the county governments are autonomous in their operations, issues when it comes to climate financing or financing of climate adaptation is still a challenge, because then you see that, you know, financing has to flow definitely from the national government and stream down to the county government. And so when you have partners that want to work with the county governments and you want to, you know, put in some money into climate adaptation, unfortunately, the monies or the financing has to still go back to the national government for accountability purposes, as we will discuss later, and then flow back to the county government. So you'd see there has been issues around bureaucracy and delay in implementation of climate adaptation projects. I'd like also to point out that in 2016, the Kenya National Climate Change Fund was set up, and this was particularly because of implementing or prioritizing climate adaptation in Kenya. And so the National Adaptation Plan was also set up consequently because of this, which required counties to develop certain financing procedures and tracking adaptations. And so you would see that also in this regard that there are counties that are way ahead as compared to others. And particularly, of course, one that I would like to present is Makueni County, where Makueni County, as you would see, where they have a decision-making chart or process of how climate change or how climate funds should be streamlined. For example, if you would be getting money from the Green Climate Fund, of course, it has to go through a state agency, which in this case is NEMA. And of course, there'll be different state agencies that they'll have to go through. And then they will get to this point where this is the Makueni County. So the Makueni County has its own governance system. Remember, as I mentioned, that the county governments are autonomous and they make decisions on how financing should be allocated in the different ministries. And so you would see that there are different offices, and under the different offices, you have different sectors. Just to mention that you would see that from the sectors, of course, depending on which sector is more relevant. For example, if you get money, let's say from the Green Climate Fund, and you would want, or rather the county decides that agriculture is more relevant, that is where the money would go to. And then it will then streamline to the counties, divisions, wards, locations, and to the villages. However, just to mention that the level between the counties and the villages are more of participatory and decision-making, where a lot is defined, as you would see in the next slide, where Makueni County, particularly in terms of participation and local decision-making, that it starts from the villages where you have the committees, the needs of the people are identified, and it moves all the way up to the clusters where you will harmonize what the community needs and action plans are developed, move all the way to the sub-wards where technocrats come and help, streamline and make sense out of what the villages and the clusters have defined as their needs and problems. And then this would move to the wards where prioritization is made, and then to the People's Forum, and the People's Forum will then communicate to the county government. I'd say this is one of the most interesting, but also successful models in the country in terms of climate adaptation financing. I think for now, I will stop here because I'm sure we'll have a panel session where we'll discuss more on Makueni County and also feed into how the national government is supporting the county. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judith. We are moving fast ahead, so we will have more time for discussion, and that is fine. I will hand over the words. Did you hear me? I will hand over the words to Sam Green to talk about international governance and locally led adaptation. And Sam, maybe you could start by introducing yourself.
Thanks, Esbern. My name's Sam Green. I'm a senior researcher in the climate change group at IIED. And I've also worked on the early phases of Kenya's county climate change funds and work on devolved climate finance mechanisms elsewhere. And thank you very much for the opportunity to share some thoughts today. I'm just going to put this into full screen. So I'm going to talk about 3 areas today, and I will try my best not to hog all the extra time that's been created for discussion. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the trouble with adaptation finance at international level. I'm going to talk a little bit about locally led adaptation, why it matters, who it's for, what the origin of this is, and then I'm going to try and pull that together into a few thoughts on a way forward for adaptation finance. So I thought it might be helpful actually to start with maybe just getting clear on what is finance for, what matters in adaptation, what makes for good adaptation. And I'm drawing most of these from the latest IPCC Working Group 2 report, which I hope is relatively uncontroversial. And what that is calling for is long-term funding for multi-stakeholder decision-making processes, particularly to avoid maladaptation. The need for local knowledge and local priorities to inform decision-making about local needs. And that's not just a climate thing that we've learned from climate change processes. That's something that's come clear from development practice over several years. The need to integrate climate risk. Climate change brings future uncertainty and variability. So we need to be able to recognize that we can't necessarily tell the risks evenly apart. So we need to be able to prepare for those. There is an important role for both formal and informal institutions, the formal ones of government, but also informal, customary institutions. We need to create spaces where they can learn, where they can be flexible and have patience for them to make mistakes, to grow, to develop and become strong institutions themselves. And we're also increasingly seeing the importance not just of adaptation projects, but projects that are transformative, that address the unequal power dynamics that sit at the root causes of vulnerability. And that's quite important because the need to be transformative, it's a word that's bandied around quite a lot, but how you finance that actually raises difficult questions for both governments as well as development partners and development contributors. So does adaptation finance help us meet these factors? Well, drawing on some more recent research, IIED's Follow the Money report and a couple of others. Firstly, it's clear there isn't enough adaptation finance going around. If you look at LDC, NDCs, they're calling for, that's their nationally determined contributions, their intention on climate change submitted to the UNFCCC. They're looking for 200 billion, and that's probably not even close to enough. And the adaptation funds available are only offering 25% of that. So there isn't enough. That's the bottom line. Localization, we accept, I think that the 10% figure is based on some assumptions, but that's in part because the data is not very clear. More recent research is making it clear that whilst funding might be aimed at localization, it's very difficult to know how local, who really gets the decision-making power. Is it local governments? And if so, which parts of local governments? At what stage is communities being able or empowered to make decisions about how funds are spent? Well, that's not really clear. It's very difficult to track. But what is clear is that non-state actors, and particularly those representing women or indigenous groups, are not being effectively targeted. And if we're going to address power dynamics, I would argue that those unequal power dynamics, I would argue that non-state actors are an important part of mediating the complex changes that are necessary to bring about transformation that can enable adaptation and resilience. There tends to be a focus on planning rather than implementation. And certainly in the case of the multilateral development banks, there's a lot of loans 45% or more of adaptation funding is in loan format, which I think is not particularly conducive to the long-term development of many LDCs in particular. So those are some issues with the numbers. I mean, looking at the governance challenges, I think one thing to be aware of is there isn't enough transparency in climate change reporting. As I've said, it's very difficult to know exactly what funds are intended for, what kind of localization they're aiming at. Even those numbers I just quoted, we had to make some assumptions in order to create some meaningful figures. Direct access is too difficult. It can take years to get GCF accredited. And even then, if you want enhanced direct access, which is a relatively new window in the fund that's supposed to give greater control to the applicant countries, that requires even more demonstration of project management skills. Funds to support readiness and access to climate finance also don't really do enough. They don't enable you to pay, for example, for staff in leading government ministries to form part of a climate finance unit. You can't pay for people's time to engage on the complexity of accessing climate finance, and that's a problem. Nationally, and I would say that this is a global problem and not just one in the most climate vulnerable countries, we see a tendency to devolving responsibility to local governments, but not necessarily the power or the funds to deliver on those responsibilities. Anybody that's been watching the UK local elections recently will see that's also a problem in the UK. The devolution agenda is not complete. It's also clear that somewhere like Kenya, the county governments have more power and more ability to act than the local governments in a country like Ethiopia or Tanzania, for example. And that raises questions for how we think about devolving adaptation. Capacity for integrating climate risk is also limited. The technical challenges of thinking about future scenarios, of building the understanding of climate change and climate risk that is necessary for robust decision-making under a range of uncertain futures is limited. And that can limit the flow of climate finance because the trust isn't there between development partners and local actors, but it can also lead to potentially maladaptive responses. And that clearly is a risk in the long term. We also tend to see a lot of siloed thinking, and that's from international down to national level. We tend to think in sectoral boxes, and that tends to make things a bit easier to organize, but climate change, as we know, is a cross-cutting challenge. The problem is that thinking across, thinking about integrating different kinds of partners from the national to the local, but also from academia through to community-based organizations, through to government and more, it's slower and it's costly. But it does allow you to engage with some of the political challenges. You're bringing different perspectives together to think through what a solution might be that can benefit the most people, whilst also recognizing who might lose out from a complex solution to climate change risks. So that is a problem. We want to do things quickly, but we also want to make sure that we're bringing in lots of different perspectives so that we can do this properly. And we're not there yet. So to come on to the principles for locally led adaptation, it's worth pointing out that these are really developed to target donors rather than national governments. Their focus is on thinking about how funding can deliver adaptation most effectively. Now, I'm not going to talk through all of these in detail, but they do pick out not just research, but these were also developed based on widespread consultation with a range of different types of institutions, from climate vulnerable countries, governments, academia, NGOs. So they bring together a range of perspectives that's based not just on research, but also based on direct experience of adaptation. In one of my other roles as the content lead for the Community-Based Adaptation Conference, it was a great opportunity to bring in grassroots perspectives on what adaptation should look like from a funding perspective. So these principles are here to act as a rallying cry, if you like, a flag to fly for what adaptation needs to look like and how funding needs to support it. And we are seeking endorsers for these principles to drive things forward. So what's the way forward? And here are some thoughts, and this list is not exhaustive. I'm sure I could consider other things as well. But firstly, we need to get the transparency right. We need to find a way of enabling countries to report on their climate finance, because without transparency, we're not going to get accountability. At the moment, things are too muddled. So we need to agree on how we're going to track climate finance more effectively, and agree on how we're going to track how climate finance is doing the job that it's supposed to be doing. Who is it reaching? How is it reaching them? All of these are important and things that we need to be able to understand in order to make sure that the climate goals are being effectively delivered on. So that's one area to get in mind, to get right. Another is to facilitate access for mechanisms rather than projects. There's a distinction, I think, between mechanisms which are reliable systems and processes that a donor can use, or a development partner or an investor can use to ensure that their funding is going to invest in adaptation projects reliably every time. And it's not a question of just getting one mechanism in place and then stopping. We need overlapping mechanisms. We're going to need mechanisms that are climate adaptive social protection, alongside mechanisms that will invest in infrastructure that builds resilience. And that might be alongside funds that enable private sector-led adaptation processes. So we need to think about a bit more complexity than we currently have now. And these mechanisms all need to draw, public or private, on the locally led adaptation principles, because that is what we think works. These mechanisms need to build institutions that are long-term in country, that can grow on experience and integrate climate risk over time. And we also need to think about how countries can access funding to develop these mechanisms effectively. At the moment, it's too challenging for countries to establish mechanisms effectively. And we need to get that right, something that needs investment. I think it's interesting to explore the role digital technologies can have in enabling locally led adaptation. Not just in terms of the quantity of climate finance, but also the quality. There are lots of tools emerging that can help to build trust and accountability around climate finance, that can disseminate climate information and help build understanding of climate risk, both with governments, but also at household level. So we need to explore what the potential for these tools are. How can we get them working in favor of high quality and high quantity climate finance? And I think it's also worth recognizing that there are limits to adaptation. And we need to think about where the limits to adaptation might be, and where loss and damage type responses might be more appropriate. And that's going to take scenario planning with communities, some forward-looking thinking and planning, so that we can work out which kind of climate finance do we need. Adaptation might not be enough, unfortunately, in some locations, and therefore we need to think about how we support communities to transform effectively. I'll stop there. I'm sure there's plenty more, and but I'm looking forward to the questions that come next. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Sam, and Lily and Judith. I have received a number of questions, and I'll try to group them together into 2 or 3 sets of questions. Lily, I'm happy to see that you're still here. So I suggest we all put everyone put their screens on. The first question is that we hear about locally led principles and the DIIS reports of needs for long-term finance. So the question is whether short-term donor financed interventions are a relevant modality to go forward. And I think this relates to the fact that we really need more, like Sam was talking about, we need more long-term finance and institutions to support climate change adaptation. And currently, a lot is done through these short-term projects. the second, if I may bulk it into a second question here, how do we better ensure that major climate fund finance programs are more responsive to local needs, both nationally and in relating to the funds themselves? So it's partly a question of the modality, quite a question of where the finance comes from. And thirdly, one could add, it's also a question of national policy framework, the extent to which climate change adaptation embraces and engages with the decentralization structures which we have in the countries, or where we see some different responses from Kenya and Tanzania, and you talked about Ethiopia, where it's more centralized governance. So I'll bring up that as the first question and ask the three of you to respond to the questions. Lily, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. Thanks very much, Espen. Yeah, and I think there also, the presentations really spoke to this quite well. And I'm just going to pick up a couple key issues, because there's always a lot that you could talk about. But I think, I mean, we ended up talking about as a conducive national policy environment. We saw also from Judith, when she did the mapping that she showed, and also the discussion from Sam, you know, what it means to have these, you know, for instance, when you have as a direct access and you know, the national as an authority, which is that bottleneck that you have. I mean, what does that mean for the process? So that's one kind of hiccup that you have that we can see already. We can see that it's so completely context dependent. Sam, you brought up a few examples, as Espen also said. So, you know, in terms of this national policy environment, it is a question also of political economy. And so there's not going to be a one size fits all solution. And, you know, it's also going to be a process, a discussion process between partners to develop what makes sense for both funders and also the domestic context. And then I had another consideration, and I think it was about the first question, but what was the first question again, Espen?
There was whether
the project modality.
whether the short-term project funding, which we know from development projects as well, is a relevant modality to go forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think I liked how Sam put it with the funding mechanism, where you can, you know, for instance, fund projects within that, but the funding the funding itself is provided over a longer time frame, that you have that sustainability that also can help as a build over time, because obviously with climate change, you're hitting a moving target. So, you know, what you need is to build the capacity at a local level and build up the institutions that can deal with that, not develop a project, then develop a project 5 years later, where by the time the project is developed, things are still changing. And so I think definitely that we need to move into something that is a different kind of funding mechanism than projects.
Okay, Judith, do you have some reflections on these questions?
Absolutely. I think as far as the first question of the LLA principles and the long-term or short-term financing, well, I'd say it's dependent also on the availability of the finance. Of course, as Sam has rightly said, that a lot of financing that is coming as far as climate adaptation is concerned is more on loans. Loans, of course, take a lot of time and it's long-term financing. And also the financing instrument in itself comes with a lot of restrictions. So of course, there are challenges that come with that kind of, you know, financing instrument, and definitely will have an impact even in terms of, you know, the community, because not so much can be changed when you're talking about debt. But when you're looking also in terms of short-term financing, for example, in the context of Kenya, you see that annually there is, according to the budget allocations, it trickles down to the annual county development, or rather the annual county budgets. And then, for example, in the case of Makueni, they put aside like 1 or 2%. This time around, it's 2% to finance climate adaptation. It might look short term, but the impact is more, because of course there are no strings attached. And secondly speaking, the county has already prioritized what is important for them. So again, it's not a direct answer to say that long or short would work, because I think there are other factors that would contribute to whether the financing modality works going forward. As far as the second question, we're looking at how financed programs are more responsive to local needs. I think I would give an example, of course, of Kenya and Makueni County, because it's a pioneer county as far as climate adaptation finance is concerned. But what they have succeeded in is in public participation. And as I showed you when I was showing on the mapping, where the community, the villages are actually involved in the designing of their priorities. So they would say that, drought is a challenge for us now as compared to maybe something else. And that way, even with the 2% that is allocated, the county is able to prioritize, even if it is drought, is it in agriculture? What is it that you want us to do for you? So that aspect of public participation, where the local communities have a voice in the project that is being financed, I think it's very important, but the structures need to be there. So this is a model structure that has worked for Makueni County. And of course, when the county government actually signs, the checks, and, they know that there is an impact, and they can go back even for accountability purposes and say, okay, this has worked. And maybe lastly, I'd like to say that when you're talking about devolving climate funds, I think it would mean prioritizing and identifying climate change needs. And this would mean that as I mentioned, the financial flows move from national to county levels, then priorities are actually defined. I think that is a very important point that I would want to emphasize. Thank you.
Okay, I'll pass it over to you, Sam. You talk about in your way forward that we need transformative institutions. Where do you see them in terms of outside projects, or in long-term government state institutions at the national level?
That's a good question. I mean, I think one of the issues at the moment is there is an imbalance of skills and capacity. There's a lot of knowledge sitting at local level, whether it's in communities or even in government, but it's not given the time and capacity to shine. It's not given the tools that they need to shine. So a lot of decisions end up being top down. I mean, I think there is definitely scope for short-term interventions that have a clearly demarcated outcome. You might want to climate-proof a certain specific infrastructure. It's an adaptation benefit. But those short-term projects, they're not going to fix the governance challenges that are central to just decision-making, that bring different people together to work as communities, as a different range of stakeholders to make effective decisions. So those short-term projects, they're not going to address the root causes of vulnerability, I think, on the whole. You're not going to get that transformative change with a short-term project. It's not to say you're never going to want to have a lightning investment in something to fix a very clear problem. And that's where the long-term, short-term comes in. Building institutions, effective institutions, takes time. You have to manage vested interests. You have to manage existing power dynamics. You might have to slowly change structures so that they fit a more flexible, adaptive way of responding to a changing climate and responding to uncertainty that the climate risk brings. So I think that's all something to bear in mind. I think, with regards to the second question on making funding programs more responsive, I think we have to reduce the number of intermediaries that are sitting in the middle of climate finance flows. There's a lot of international organizations who bring a lot of expertise, but they're cutting out the opportunities for direct access. They're getting in the way. When if you listen to the community-based adaptation conference, and what local practitioners are saying is They want INGOs to play a role convening, sharing knowledge, helping them build their capabilities to do things like gender analysis or do MEL, but they don't want them sitting on large projects and then coming out and with basically top-down set objectives and then handing out cash to them as local partners. They want to be directly accessing the funds. And I think that's quite important, is seeking to change the role of intermediaries to make them more brokers and not people who are getting in the way of the flow of funds. I think one other thing that I would add in terms of responsiveness is building greater skills for participatory engagement in decision-making. The skills out there for doing participatory research and using that as a tool of government planning are quite limited. I think that's something that we need to think about and invest in. How are we building skills for doing more than just a household survey or a few focus groups and a consultation in order to define a local government development plan? How can we build institutions that can carry out more in-depth research to inform their own planning? And we need to invest in those skills, not just in LDC, but actually, I'd argue, globally, in terms of addressing the complexity of climate risks that we all face.
I think, Sam, you touched upon something very central about what is climate change adaptation capacity. That it is really in the light of devolved climate change adaptation. It's about capacity to make priorities and have inclusive governance at the local level, which is something perhaps different from the more technical content of some of these capacity development courses which are currently taking place. So I'll move to the next set of questions, which there's one saying, in practice, climate change adaptation and other local development activities are closely related. Do you think that the devolved climate finance should be ring-fenced for climate purposes, or are there ways to link up to climate change finance with broader local government budgets and development activities? To what extent should you integrate the two? And in specific, the Kenyan Climate Change Fund, this question says, it looks very promising, but as for now, it remains somehow theoretical approach where structures have been put in place in place like Mangweni County, but there's not much show in terms of practice. It hasn't really been financed yet. What are the prospects of a model like the KCCF in the light of political willingness or unwillingness to give up political control centrally? And maybe one could expand it to how is this kind of model in Kenya, which is very much based on local government and national structures, compared with the more with the other examples highlighted in the DIIS report, which is somehow more project driven. Do you want to give a go at it, Lily?
Yes, thank you, Espen. I'll just speak really briefly to that first question that you had, and that's about integrating adaptation and development. And we actually had a report that went into this a couple of years ago, where, I mean, we looked at what happens when you take climate change adaptation and kind of disaggregate it from development efforts and development considerations. And of course, you get something that can be very focused, but at the same time isn't responsive to a wider set of needs. And as we know, climate change, it occurs within a larger context of all sorts of development dynamics. And so of course it's, in that sense, very problematic to divide it out. Then you get this kind of very siloed approach that we've already heard about today. And, you know, of course, as Sam said, you could have very focused projects that have like a very specific climate related goal. But at the same time, if those aren't developed on the basis of a wider set of development needs, then you can actually kind of undermine development and adaptation going forward. And I think this is a big issue because, you know, looking at the way that financing is at the moment for adaptation, a lot of it is coming through existing development finance, which is great. At the same time, what's not happening is climate change adaptation is not necessarily being thought in from the beginning. So you're not having vulnerability assessments or something like that with a specific climate focus, specific vulnerability focus for instance, marginalized groups that's happening from the beginning of these projects. So it's very much after the fact. And that's also not going to give you effective and sustainable adaptation. So I think definitely you need to integrate them. But that needs to happen from the beginning of idea development, as a program formulation, and so on. I'm going to have to go. Thank you very much.
Just to follow up on what Lily was saying here, it's I mean, in very bulk figures, my understanding of the climate change finance is like 20% is coming from these climate change funds, around 40% from the multilateral development banks, and around 40% from bilateral development assistance programs. So we and much of the discussion here is around the funds, but really the bulk of the funding is through development programs. Just to highlight what Lily said. Judith, do you want to have a comment on the Kenya Climate Change Fund, which how do you see that when it begins to get financed? What is the prospect of financing? Because right now it's mainly at the pilot phase, as I understand it.
Yeah, I think the Kenya Climate Change Fund is well, it is yet to be operationalized, but in my opinion, I think it's a very promising model, because then it would unlock, you know, the specified, let's say, climate adaptation financing to the county, to the specific, or let's say, for example, like in Makueni Climate Change Fund, Machakos Climate Fund, so the different counties, because they are supposed to develop their own county climate change funds, and this will stem definitely from the national Kenya Climate Change Fund. However, because there is the Public Finance Management Act that looks into that, all finances need to be accounted for at the national level. So as I mentioned earlier on, the challenge that the county governments are going to have is that, you know, however much that they are autonomous in their operations or in their governance, they still have to rely on the, you know, financing from the Kenya Climate Change Fund. So for example, if, let's say, the World Bank cannot give money directly to Makueni County Climate Change Fund, and this is because of the Public Finance Management Act. It says that all monies have to go through the national government and stream down to the county level. And this is a challenge, of course, because then if you're looking at it from a delay perspective or the bureaucracies or the bottlenecks, you find that it will take time by the time it will take a lot of time by the time the county governments are receiving the money. And that, for me, is a challenge. And also just to mention that as it stands now, even with the county climate change funds, however much you have, let's say, the INGOs and the private sector in the counties and implementing projects in the county, they cannot give money to the county climate change fund. So for example, Makueni County Climate Change Fund has been there, but still they however much, you know, let's say a private sector would want to come and say, we want to work with you on a priority on climate adaptation, they cannot send money to the county climate change fund. And this is because, of course, of what I mentioned earlier on. And so it looks like it is a basket that is there, but it's empty. The only portfolio that the fund has is the 2% that is from the annual budgets. And so that is a challenge, of course, for the climate change, the system as is. And of course, the partners will remain custodians. So you'll come with your money, but you have to remain a custodian of your own money or your own financing. Of course, by signing MOUs with the county government. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, Sam, could you add a comment?
Thanks. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that climate resilient development is the objective we're going for here, and that there is a great wealth of local knowledge and experience to draw on at community level. And one of the reasons I think, one but not all of the reasons I think that knowledge and experience is effective is because when you're looking at it from the ground up, you don't see things in sectors. You see it holistically. You see how a particular intervention or investment has impacts across the way that you operate your livelihood. So, you know, to give an example from around Arusha or even in Isiolo in northern Kenya with drylands, if you put in a water source, that's not just a water project. That is a water project that has significant implications for land and land management, that will have implications for the ability of women to generate income, and a range of other bits and pieces that play into a holistic understanding of how interventions affect people's day-to-day lives. And you know, what that's really saying is communities aren't seeing a distinction between climate and development expenditure. So, and that's where we have to start. If we're going to recognize that local knowledge about local politics and local priorities are important, we have to get beyond those distinctions one way or another. And while we recognize that there might be a politically useful distinction at international level so that we are pushing for additional climate finance on top of the development finance, from the ground up, we need to try and find a way to bring that together so that it can, that climate finance can harmonize with development expenditure more effectively. I think that's quite important to bear in mind. I think also with the county climate change funds in Kenya, as well as the other similar models piloted elsewhere, what has been relatively unique about these approaches is an attempt to change the relationship between the state and the citizen, so that the ward committees in the county climate change funds that were piloted in Makueni and Isiolo, that they bridge local knowledge into the formal system. There's a wealth of local knowledge about land and farming, and particularly in the pastoralist communities, about customary natural resource management systems. And it was difficult for government to understand that knowledge and access it. But the idea of the ward committees is that you're bringing in knowledge into those that can then inform the way that formal government funds are spent. So you're creating this deeper sense of partnership between states and citizens that wasn't there before. And that's, for me at least, one of the big innovations in those kinds of mechanisms. And I think that is one way to start getting beyond this development and climate distinction, because those committees are able to get beyond that in the way that they advise climate adaptation expenditure.
Yes, I very much agree with you, and I think that's why that is why we chose to focus on the Climate Change Adaptation Fund in Kenya, and you have other examples in Bangladesh and elsewhere. The PPCR in Zambia, the World Bank's program, has other advantages, but and the same with the UNCDF in Mozambique. However, they are from a donor trying to set up systems, but you have something unique in these national developed systems of getting local knowledge from below. Maybe a very last question, or we are about to be finished. There's a last question saying we focus a lot of getting money downwards where it's needed, but might devolution of adaptive finance also pave the way for greater subnational inputs upwards from increased agency locally up towards the national policy of creating more transformative institutions? A very brief comment on that, like 30 seconds each. Judith, do you have an idea?
Yeah.
Last comments there.
Yeah, well, I think the bottom-up approach is key to ensure that the success of projects, rightly said by Sam. projects and interventions at any level. And I think this would be important, of course, when you're looking at strong data, as Sam has rightly said, when you're doing monitoring and evaluation, any feedback mechanisms. I think this is important because it will help either the government, international, national partners in planning, but also implementing climate adaptation interventions.
Thank you
very much. But then
much.
Also, one last point, but also I think it's very important to look at it also as an entry point for private sector. I think bottom line, it is a customer base for them. So why not? Thank you.
And I think, Sam, I'm afraid the time have run out. Thank you very much for participating in this webinar. We will come back with more webinars, and you can download the report free of charge, or you can get a hard copy if you come by DIIS. Also check out the new GAP program on our the DIIS website. Thank you very much for now, and have a nice week. Thanks.